She's always been the difficult one. Brilliant on paper maybe, but impossible to live with. You've done more for this family in 1 year than she has in 35. My mother said that to my brother-in-law. Not in a quiet hallway, not in a whispered phone call I was never meant to hear. She said it at the dining table at my aunt's house in Oakville, Ontario, with 14 people seated around it, wine glasses half full, the smell of roast lamb still hanging in the air. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Flat, certain, not even looking at me. My brother-in-law, Terrence, had just accepted a promotion at the hospital administration where he worked. Director of Operations. My mother had spent the last 20 minutes describing his achievement to the table as though she had personally trained him for the role. She squeezed his forearm. She told my uncle he reminded her of my grandfather, who had been a department head at Toronto General in the 70s. Terrence had the grace to look uncomfortable. He glanced at me sideways. I was sitting 4 seats down, holding a glass of sparkling water, wearing my lanyard because I had driven directly from the hospital where I had been on call since 6 that morning. The lanyard had my photo, my name, and beneath it, 3 words, Chief of Cardiology. My mother hadn't mentioned that once. I pressed the side of my thumb against the edge of the table and held it there, a habit I had developed years ago when I needed to stay in my body and out of my own head. The table was cold, old pine. My aunt had refinished it herself the summer before, sanding it down on the back deck while her knees ached and my mother watched from the lawn chair and offered opinions. I didn't say a word. I had learned, a long time ago, that words cost more than they returned in that family. What nobody at that table knew, including Terrence, including my sister who was smiling pleasantly into her lamb, was that 3 weeks earlier I had been the second surgeon, called into an emergency theater at St. Raphael's Medical Center at 2 in the morning. The first surgeon had been unable to stabilize the patient. The patient was a 62-year-old man with a dissecting aortic aneurysm that had ruptured during what was supposed to be a routine angioplasty. The kind of case that ends careers. The kind of case that ends lives, usually the patient's. It did not end that night. But before I tell you what happened when the physician who had been in that theater walked into my aunt's dining room 6 hours into that family dinner, and why the look on his safe face made my mother stop speaking mid-sentence for the first time in my memory, let me tell you something about the woman who raised me and what she decided I was worth before I was old enough to argue. My mother's name is not important. What is important is the architecture of her logic. She was a woman who organized the world by visible achievement. Titles, offices, salaries, the right postal code. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Hamilton, the daughter of a man who drove a forklift and a woman who cleaned offices at night, and she had spent her entire adult life building as much distance from that origin as she could manage. She was not cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. She didn't scream, she didn't hit, she curated. She selected which parts of her children's lives reflected well on her, and she polished those parts for display. The rest, she quietly discarded. My sister was the display piece. 3 years younger than me, softer at the edges, easier to introduce at church, easier to bring to my father's colleagues' dinner parties, easier to describe at book club. She married Terrence at 28 at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and my mother cried twice during the ceremony. Once at the vows, and once when the photographer asked the family to gather on the steps. She put her arm around my sister and looked directly into the lens, and her face held exactly the expression of a woman whose life had gone according to plan. I stood at the far left of the frame. I had been on shift the night before, and my eyes showed it. My mother had wanted me to be a teacher, not because she thought it was noble, because she could explain it to people. Saying your daughter is a teacher at a dinner party produces a certain response. Saying your daughter is doing a cardiology residency at McMaster produces a silence that my mother had never learned to navigate. She didn't understand what I did, and for her, not understanding something was the same as it not existing. When I was 16, I brought home my first provincial science award, a certificate and a small trophy, acrylic, the kind that catches the light on a shelf. I set it on the kitchen counter when I came home and went to wash my hands. When I came back, my mother had moved it to the top of the refrigerator, above the sightline. Behind the ceramic rooster, she kept up there for reasons no one had ever successfully determined. She didn't say anything about it. She was on the phone with my aunt discussing the wine selection for my sister's upcoming confirmation dinner. That night, I climbed up on the counter and got the trophy down and put it in my room. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at it for a while. My father came in around 10. He knocked twice, 3 knuckles, soft. He had that knock. Nobody else in the house knocked like that. He sat in the chair by the window, the one with the armrests that was slightly loose, and he looked at the trophy and then he looked at me. "You know what that cost you," he said. I said I did. "And you know it was worth it." He wasn't asking, he was confirming. My father was a man who operated on confirmed knowledge, not wishful thinking. He had spent 26 years as a structural engineer, and he believed that things either held weight or they didn't, and the only way to find out was to apply pressure and see what happened. He placed his hand on top of my head for a moment, the way he had done since I was small, and then he said something I kept for a long time in the back part of my mind, where I stored things that were too important to take out too often. The work is real whether or not she looks at it. You do the work. The rest is someone else's problem. He left and I sat there another 20 minutes and then I went to bed. I got into medicine the way most people get into medicine, which is that it was never really a choice. It was a recognition. I was 15 years old watching a documentary about open heart surgery on a Thursday night because the television in the kitchen, the only one my parents permitted in common rooms, was showing something my father wanted to see, and I sat on the floor beside his chair and I watched a surgeon open a chest cavity and reach inside and hold a human heart in both hands, and I felt something in my own chest shift, like a compass finding north. My mother walked through the living room once during that documentary, glanced at the screen, said, "Honestly, Lloyd, you and your programs," and went to the kitchen to refill her tea. My father said nothing. He was watching with the same focused stillness he brought to engineering blueprints. I don't think she noticed that I hadn't moved in 40 minutes. I applied to medical school at Western the fall I turned 22. I had done my undergraduate at U of T, honors science, a grade point average that had required me to consistently choose studying over the social rituals my mother periodically asked why I wasn't participating in. I printed my application at the library, paid the fee with the money I had saved from 3 years of evening shifts at a medical supply warehouse, and I told my mother about it over dinner on a Tuesday. She set down her fork. "Medical school," she said. "Yes! That's 9 more years, roughly." She picked her fork back up. "You'll never find a husband." My father made a small sound. Not a laugh. Something more controlled than a laugh. He reached for the salt shaker and adjusted the placement of it slightly to the right and did not comment further. I was accepted in the spring. My mother did not mention it at church. She did not mention it at the neighborhood barbecue that July. When Mrs. Kowalski from down the street asked how I was getting on, my mother said I was still in school and pivoted immediately to asking about Mrs. Kowalski's son, who had just been hired at a downtown law firm. My father drove me to my first day of orientation. We parked in the visitor lot and he turned off the engine and sat for a moment. Outside the window, the campus was full of 22-year-olds with lanyards and anxious expressions, and the particular kind of determination that only appears in people who have just begun to understand how much they don't yet know. "She'll come around," he said. I looked at him. He looked back at me and then he looked at the windshield. "Or she won't," he said. "Either way." He squeezed my shoulder once and then reached across and opened my door from the inside the way he had done since I was small, a gesture that meant, "Go ahead. I've got you from here." He did not come around to my side of the car. His hip had been bad since the winter. I didn't ask him to. Residency was 7 years of my life that I do not fully remember in linear sequence. I remember pieces. The smell of the cardiac unit at 2 in the morning. The particular silence of a waiting room when a family is expecting news. The resident supervisor who told me in my second year that my diagnostic instincts were the best he had seen in 15 years of teaching, and that if I didn't slow down, I would burn out before 40. I did not slow down. I was not burning. I was running towards something, not away from it. My father had a cardiac event in my 5th year of residency. Mild, they said. Caught early. He was home within a week. I drove to Hamilton the weekend after he was discharged and sat with him in the kitchen while he drank decaffeinated coffee and complained about the hospital food with the particular grievance of a man who has been inconvenienced but knows better than to complain about the actual situation. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine. I know you're fine. You look tired anyway." I told him about a case I had worked on that month. A 44-year-old woman, anomalous coronary artery, surgery on a Tuesday, home the following Friday. He listened the way he always listened, completely, no interruptions, turning his coffee mug slowly in both hands as though he was taking measurements. When I finished, he said, "That's a good week's work." That was all. That was enough. My mother had arranged the living room while he was in the hospital. She had moved furniture, reorganized the bookshelves, donated 2 boxes to Value Village. She said it was because the old layout made it hard to vacuum. My father said nothing. He sat in his chair, the one she had moved 6 inches to the left, and looked at where his side table used to be, and said nothing. That was the year I stopped expecting her to change. Not from anger, from data. There are a limited number of experiments you can run before you accept the result. I completed my fellowship in interventional cardiology at Toronto General and accepted a position at St. Raphael's, a regional hospital outside of Guelph, Ontario. Not the highest profile posting available to me, but it was a hospital with a cardiac unit that had been underperforming for 6 years and a surgical backlog that was contributing to preventable deaths and a department that needed someone willing to look at the structure and rebuild it from the inside. My supervisor at Toronto General told me most people with my credentials would choose a teaching hospital in a major center. He wasn't wrong. I chose this anyway. My mother told her book club I was working at a hospital near Guelph. She did not mention the department, the role, or the reason I had chosen it. She did not ask me any of those things, so she did not know them to mention. My father called me the week I started. He asked about the cardiac unit's existing protocols. We talked for 45 minutes. He had read the publicly available hospital quality reports beforehand and had specific questions about bypass time averages and post-operative infection rates. I answered all of them. I told him I was going to need at least 18 months before anyone could measure what I was building. He said that sounds right. He had a second cardiac event 8 months after that call. This one was not mild. He was in the ICU for 11 days. I drove back and forth from Guelph 6 times in those 11 days. My mother called me on day 3 to tell me the visiting hours, and on day 9 to say that the neighbors had been very kind about bringing food. She did not call me on day 11, my sister did. I made it to Hamilton 2 hours before he died. I sat with him for those 2 hours, and I held his hand and I told him things I had spent 20 years meaning to say out loud. Some of them he already knew. Some of them I think he'd been waiting to hear me say rather than just think. At one point, he squeezed my hand. Weak, but deliberate. I squeezed back. That was our last real conversation. The funeral was at a church in Hamilton that my mother had attended for 30 years. She wore a charcoal dress and accepted condolences from a receiving line of people I mostly did not recognize. She organized the order of service and selected the hymns and decided the seating arrangement at the reception. She had planned it the way she planned everything, with precision and without consultation. I arrived in my car alone, having driven from Guelph at 5 in the morning. I was wearing the dark dress I kept for occasions that required formal clothing. My hospital lanyard was in my coat pocket. I had taken it off in the parking lot. My mother was standing with my sister and Terence near the entrance when I walked up. She looked at me, nodded, and turned back to the conversation she had been having with my aunt. Not a hug, not a word. I went inside and sat in the 3rd row. Over the course of the next 2 hours, I received exactly one acknowledgement from anyone on my mother's side of the church. My cousin, who was 11, tugged my sleeve and asked if I was sad. I said yes. She nodded seriously and then went back to reading the order of service. At the reception in the church hall, my mother moved through the room like a host, steering guests, accepting casseroles, redirecting conversations. Every time someone began to make their way toward me, she appeared beside them, a hand on an elbow, a word in an ear, a gentle rerouting toward the photo display she had set up on the far table. The photos were all ones she had selected. My father at my sister's wedding. My father at a family cottage in Muskoka from the 90s. My father and my mother at their 40th anniversary dinner. There was no photo from the day I pinned on my department badge. He had been there that day. He had driven himself to Guelph even though the physiotherapist had told him to avoid long drives. He had sat in the 2nd row of the small auditorium where the hospital held its formal recognition events. He had watched me shake hands with the chief of medicine and accept the role I had spent 9 years building toward. Afterward, he had stood in the parking lot with me for 20 minutes in the cold, and we had talked about the work, the unit, the cases already waiting on the list, the protocols I needed to revise before the surgical backlog could begin to clear. He was wearing his good coat and a tie he had worn to every important occasion I could remember, and his hands shook a little when he buttoned his collar. He didn't mention the shaking. I didn't mention it either. When he left, I watched his car until it turned out of the lot, and then I stood in the parking lot alone for another few minutes in the cold. I did not have a photo from that day. I had the memory. The annual St. Raphael's Community Health Symposium was held every September at the Convention Center in Guelph. Hospital staff, community partners, donor families, local politicians. The sort of evening where the hospital presented its year's work to the people who funded and trusted it, with speeches and a catered dinner and the particular formality of institutional gratitude done in public. My mother came because my sister had suggested it. My sister thought it would be good for her to see where I worked, to understand what I did. My sister, who is genuinely kind, still believed at that point that understanding was something my mother was interested in. I had been asked to speak. Brief remarks on the cardiac unit's outcomes over the past fiscal year. The unit had reduced surgical wait times by 31%. Post-operative complications were down. 2 cases that would have required transfer to Toronto 18 months or had been handled internally. These were not small numbers. In healthcare terms, these were the kind of numbers that meant people who would have spent months on a wait list were instead going home to their families. I stood at the podium and delivered the remarks, and then I returned to my seat at the staff table. My mother was 3 tables over, beside my sister and Terence. I had nodded at them when I came in. My mother had nodded back. She was wearing the blue dress she wore to events she considered worth dressing for. That was, I noted something. What happened after the formal program ended was not something I had planned or anticipated. Dr. Osi Mensah arrived late. He had been delayed. His assistant had texted the event coordinator, something at his clinic in Toronto. He was a cardiologist of some standing, which is a quiet way of saying that people in medicine knew his name the way people in other fields know certain names without having to explain the context. He had trained at Johns Hopkins and practiced for 20 years and written papers that were cited in the programs where I had trained. He was, among other things, the physician who had been in the operating theater 3 weeks earlier when the aortic aneurysm had ruptured and the first surgical approach had failed to stabilize the patient. He was also my mother's oldest friend's son, which is why he had been invited tonight. He came through the doors as the last of the formal programming was finishing, shook a hand near the entrance, looked around the room, and then stopped. He was looking at the name on the standing display beside the podium, the one that read Chief of Cardiology, St. Raphael's Medical Center, and beneath it my name and photo. He stood there for a moment. Then he crossed the room directly, past 3 tables of people he presumably knew, not stopping, not pausing to greet anyone, and came to stand in front of me. The room was still loud with the particular noise of a reception unwinding. But the people nearby noticed, the way people notice when someone enters a space with too much intention to be casual. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, and his voice carried, not because he raised it, but because it had that quality some voices develop after years of delivering news in quiet rooms. "You're the surgeons who pulled my patient back." The table near us went quiet. I said yes. He turned to the room with the particular stillness of a man who has no interest in performing, but who understands when something needs to be said out loud. 3 weeks ago, I had a patient on the table who was not going to survive the night. I know what the situation was. I know what I was looking at. He paused. She rebuilt the approach in under 4 minutes. Things I had not considered, things I'm not certain I would have reached in time. He stopped. She saved that man's life. Not the unit, not the protocol, her. The room was very quiet. My mother, 3 tables over, had stopped speaking. I had no prepared response for this. I am not a person who has ever been comfortable being the subject of a room's attention. I looked down at the table for a moment and then I looked back at him. He had a strong constitution, I said. That helped. He almost smiled. It helped some. There is a particular sound that happens in a room when a story has been completed that the audience didn't know was being told. It is not applause exactly. It is a kind of released breath, a collective recognition. That was the sound the room made. My mother had her hand flat on the tablecloth. She was not looking at Dr. Osi Mensah. She was looking at me. At the break, she made her way across the room, not immediately. She waited until Dr. Osi Mensah had moved on, until the attention in the room had redistributed itself. Then she came, and she stood beside me, and for a moment she said nothing. I waited. I was not going to fill the silence for her. I had done that my whole life. I was done with it. "Patricia tells me he's very well regarded," she finally said. Patricia was her oldest friend, Dr. Osi Mensah's mother. "He is. She didn't tell me he knew you." "He didn't until 3 weeks ago." My mother looked at her glass. She had the expression she wore when she was working out how a piece of information fit with a narrative she had already constructed. Like someone trying to fit a new board into an existing floor when the measurements aren't quite matching. She said, "What he described." "That happens often?" "Not that specific situation. The kind of decision, yes." She was quiet again. Around us the reception was moving, the noise of people, chairs, plates being cleared. "Your father," she said, and then she stopped. I waited again. He would have liked this evening. It was not an apology. I did not expect one. People like my mother do not issue apologies. They issue adjacencies. Statements that float near the truth without landing on it. Proximity as acknowledgement. A way of saying something without accepting the cost of having said it. I looked at her. I had not looked at her this directly in years. She was older. There were things in her face I hadn't had the opportunity to notice, because I had been too busy bracing for what the face was about to do. She was not going to become a different woman. The woman standing beside me at this reception was the same woman who had moved the trophy above the sightline, who had not called me on the day my father died, who had organized a funeral where no one was permitted to acknowledge my presence. That woman was not going anywhere, but I was not 18 anymore. I was not 16 with a trophy above the refrigerator. I was not standing at a kitchen table watching my future be described as a problem. I had built a department from the inside out, and I had held the lives of people I had never met before in both hands, and I had brought them back. She could not touch that. Nobody who had not earned it could touch it. He would have liked it, I agreed. I picked up my glass and I excused myself. I drove back to Guelph that night alone. I had an early consult the next morning, a 60-year-old woman referred from a clinic in Cambridge with an anomalous finding on her stress test that the referring physician had flagged as requiring urgent review. I had read her file that afternoon. I knew what I was likely looking at. I had already thought through the approach. I stopped at a gas station outside of Guelph and bought a coffee, the bad kind, the kind that comes from a machine and tastes like industrial promise, and I sat in my car in the lot for 15 minutes and drank it. My father had died 13 months before that evening. I thought about him. I thought about the knock, 3 knuckles, soft. The way he had sat in the chair beside the window, with the slightly loose armrest, and looked at things I was doing and said, in the plainest language available, that the work was real. I reached into the glove compartment and took out the thing I had kept there since the day I drove away from Hamilton after the funeral. A folded piece of graph paper, the kind engineers use, covered in my father's handwriting. He had given it to me years before, when I was in my second year of medical school, and I had called him at midnight because I had failed a practical assessment, and I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, not entirely certain I was going to be able to get up again. He had listened to me on the phone for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he had said, "Get up, brush your teeth, go to sleep, and call me tomorrow." I did. The next week, he had mailed me the graph paper. On it, in his careful engineering hand, he had drawn a simple load-bearing diagram, a structure under pressure. Arrows indicating force from multiple directions. At the base of the structure, in his handwriting, "What holds is what was built right." I had carried that piece of paper since medical school. Through residency, through fellowship, through every night I had sat in an operations room or a surgical suite or a parking lot at 2 in the morning, wondering whether I had made the right call. I unfolded it in the car and looked at it for a while in the dome light. Then I folded it again and put it back. Not because I was done with it. Because it belonged in the car. Because some things are meant to travel with you, not be set down somewhere. I drove back to Guelph, and I went to bed at 11, and I was in the hospital by 6:30 the next morning, standing in front of the imaging board in the cardiac unit, looking at the films from the Cambridge referral, thinking about the work. My mother called on a Sunday 3 weeks later. This was unusual. She called on holidays and on birthdays, which I found when I reviewed it to be a relatively efficient approach to maintaining minimum viable family contact. A Sunday in October was outside the established pattern. I let it ring twice, then answered. She asked about the drive to Guelph. She asked whether I had found a good place to buy groceries. She asked whether the hospital had parking. These were questions she had never asked before, which meant she was building towards something, or she was trying out a new behavior and wasn't sure of the mechanics yet. I answered all of them. Then she said, "Patricia showed me the hospital website, the department page." I said nothing. "There's a list of the wait time improvements." She paused. "And the cases." "There's a summary, yes. It's quite a list. It's the department's work." "Stop doing that," she said. And for a moment her voice had something in it I didn't immediately recognize. Something stripped of the usual management. "It's your work," Patricia said. "Gerald thinks very highly of you." Gerald was Dr. Osis Mensah's first name. "He's generous," I said. "He's not known for being generous with opinions," she said. Patricia would know. There was a silence. Outside my window, the maple on the street had gone fully orange. I had barely noticed the season changing. That happened to me sometimes, whole months arriving and departing while I was in the hospital, and then one day I would look out a window and the light would be different, and I would realize I had lost the transition entirely. "I didn't understand what you were doing," she said. "For a long time." I said nothing. "I'm not sure I fully understand it now." Another pause. "But I understand that it matters." This was not an apology. Let me be clear about that. An apology would have required her to name specific things, to hold them and look at them, and acknowledge that they had caused harm. This was not that. This was a woman of 71 who had lived her entire life inside a logic that had just been partially revised by a cardiologist's remarks at a community health symposium. Partial revision is not the same as accountability. I knew that. I also knew that for her, this phone call was the furthest she was capable of traveling. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "I meant it, and I didn't mean it, and both of those things were true at the same time, which is perhaps the most adult sentence I know." We spoke for another few minutes about ordinary things. The weather in Hamilton. My sister's plans for the upcoming Thanksgiving. Whether the grocery chain near my apartment carried the specific brand of coffee she thought I should be drinking. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I set it on the table and went back to the patient file I had been reviewing. The work was there. It had always been there. It had been there on the kitchen floor in Hamilton when I was 16, and on the corridor floor in medical school at midnight, and on the satellite map in the operating theater at 2 in the morning. The work did not depend on whether she looked at it. My father had told me that, and he had been right, and the 25 years since he said it had not produced a single piece of evidence to the contrary. I went back to the file. Outside the maple was orange, and I had missed the whole slow turn of it, all those weeks of green becoming gold becoming this, and that was fine. I would see the next one. I had time. The work was real whether or not she looked at it. I looked at it. That was enough.